Yeah, well, look, I was actually recruited and approached and recruited, and I agreed to move into the intelligence sector because with air traffic control, I already had command and control experience. So it was an easy move for me. And I enjoyed the work. I found it very, very interesting, very challenging. It was operational work, so it was good for me. I learned a lot about people. And of course, obviously, working with intelligence, you become fairly astute at figuring out people. And then, I carried on with that. And then eventually I studied some law. I did some criminology, just as a hobby, actually, strangely enough. And then I had my son. I got married to a person who was a disaster. He was an alcoholic that lasted 2 years. And then my son was just about to go to school, and I was kind of wanting to go back and study again, and I didn't know what to study. And I had some law, obviously. So I thought about going into law, and I took a job working for an advocate. And that advocate turned out to be a serial rapist.
Oh, God.
And that was when I made the decision to go into profiling, because I was quite fascinated. He managed to recruit another little young girl. She was also just out of university, also an advocate. And he basically turned her into a sex slave. They then raped and molested all the people that worked for them, their secretaries, and it went on that they went out and raped a whole bunch of children that they procured from orphanages. It was quite a messy story. I wrote a best-selling book on that. On that trial.
Okay.
So that was when I decided to.
And how long were you working for this person for?
Well, fortunately, I figured out very, very quickly what he was. Okay. So I protected myself, and I only worked for him for 5 weeks.
This is before any accusation came down. So did you just not like him?
Yes. Well.
Or did you actually?
It was rather a funny story. I'd worked for him for 5 weeks, and I already had the intel background, so I realized that there was some rather odd things occurring in the house. And it was very, very amusing. On my birthday, he presented me with see-through underwear, a very skimpy G-string, and a see-through bra. And he said to me that he thought it would be good to make me feel more like a woman.
Wow.
Anyway, I popped over to my gran and I showed my grandmother this birthday present. And I said to my gran, well, what would you do? And she said, I'd pop down to Total Sports and buy some Nike Tackies. And I said, Nike Tackies, why? And she said, my girl, you're going to need them when you're running down the driveway. And that was kind of it. Decision made. I went back and I did a degree, a specialist degree in profiling. And followed that up with an honors criminology. And, I'm a bit of a study-holic, so I continued to study. I did, and also at Intelligence, we did behavioral analysis, body language, interpretation, interrogation. So I already had the background. And I haven't looked back.
Is there, in the intelligence kind of background about, things you can, of course, talk about. What was your main task? Were you actually operational? Were you more of studying things on the back on at your desk? How would that work?
I was operational.
Okay.
Fully operational.
Okay. Must be tough.
And then I specialized more towards the interview and interrogation side in the end.
Were you interrogating alleged terrorists? What kind of profile were you?
Well, yeah. Interrogation is a swear word these days. Now just interviewing.
Okay. Gotcha. Still, that's an interesting subject, because one thing that I think is incredibly, okay, I believe, and this is probably something that you will agree on, is you definitely have a lot to learn from other people, and there's things you can take from other, whether it's industries, other sectors, other ways of life, other sports, that can actually benefit you in your day to day. And I always thought, working in advertising for so many years, there's an aspect, or there's an element of the word profiling that definitely overlaps with what probably you have experienced. And this is, to break it down more simply, is you understand your audience, people that are engaging with you on social media. You check what kind of behavior patterns there are. So if 50% of these people are men, maybe that doesn't mean anything. But if you find out that these 50% of men also, and suppose you're a car brand, and then also happen to follow another tennis athlete, then the next time you have a celebrity to endorse your brand, you'll make sure that he's definitely the person you're going to have to go to. And these information nowadays are available. Data, as you know, is available at a glance, especially for advertisers. So that's one thing where I think the concept of profiling has been very useful in my point of view. So strategy definition for a brand. And then the other one, where I haven't seen many people really apply knowledge from profiling, which might be very useful and might make the interview process less painful for people, but also more efficient and less subject to human error, is actually interviews. So HR. So the other element is, understanding people before you actually hire them, to make sure that they have the right mindset, not necessarily just a skill set, which are two separate things.
Absolutely. I'm actually, strangely enough, writing an article at the present time for Wealth Magazine on HR profiling, but not only HR profiling as in with the recruitment process. It's also very important to do the testing and the psychological tests, the aptitude tests, to find out where people are comfortable. Because strangely enough, one of the reasons firms lose really, really good employees sometimes is that they promote them into management positions without testing them for management personality traits.
Yeah.
And you lose a really good salesperson by making him a sales manager, because he doesn't have the personality to be a manager.
Yeah, true.
So he becomes very unhappy in his job because he doesn't want to assume that management role. And you think you've done him a favor by promoting him, but actually in the end you lose your employee and you lose your manager, because they don't want to fill that space, or they don't have the personality type capable of filling the management role.
I totally agree with you, and I've seen this happen so many times in my career.
So profiling has so many uses. So you have your screening process at the beginning, where you can do your background checks and your criminal records checks and your personality types and your integrity screening and your aptitude testing and all that sort of thing. And then you have your career development path, and then you have your management roles. And so you're actually, there is a lot of scope for profiling. Myself, it's slightly different. I work predominantly with sex and violent offenders, sexual and violent offenders. And then, strangely enough, I was pulled quite off course a couple of years ago and brought into the risk management side for mining. and then also into fraud for the banks, investigation of fraud cases for the banks, especially internal threat and the profiling of internal threat. And then working here in Africa as well, I moved into a different sector, which hasn't really been studied very well. But what I was finding, I can't speak for other people, but what I was finding is that all elements of all crimes today have an element where a computer is used. So I started looking into the mindset of hackers and digital criminals, because, for example, serial murder now usually will have an element of cyber stalking or cyber bullying or something cyber that will preempt the actual attack.
It is the easiest gateway to someone's life, right? Like the first thing you want to know if you want to understand someone, you won't be going there and asking questions. You probably go and check their Facebook profile if it's open.
Well, the thing is, people are really, really, pardon the word, but stupid when it comes to what they post.
Yeah.
I fight with my family quite frequently, and I'll say to them, for heaven's sake, don't post photographs of your children in a state of undress. Don't post that photo in a bikini. Don't post that naked photograph of a toddler running on the beach. Yes, it's great for your family album. Keep it there. Because those photographs of naked toddlers, for example, hit the dark web 15 seconds after you've posted them, and the pedophiles are feasting on them.
Yeah.
Plus, these people don't think about the fact that their location is on. They are eating at a restaurant. They'll say eating at the Wimpy on Durban Beach, for example. They've posted the photograph of the car they drive. They've posted the photograph of the child at receiving an award at school. Those perpetrators now know everything. They know what car you drive. They know where you work. They know who your husband is, where your child goes to school. These children today are easy targets just because of irresponsible use of social media. And to try and get this through to people is almost impossible, because people are egotistical and they want to brag about their lives and show their friends how fantastically their children are doing. And they don't realize that the danger that they're inadvertently placing these children into today. And believe me, these pedophilic rings are everywhere. They troll. It's not like it used to be, where the pedophile was sitting in an old car watching the schools. These guys help each other. They network. They're on the dark web. Those photos are being sold. They will distribute information, all information. They help each other to find victims.
They're a well-connected.
It's a well-connected
hidden organization.
Syndicate.
I think there's a couple of elements I need to go back on that you mentioned earlier before we get into this very, very disturbing subject, of course. You mentioned sexual offenders, working a lot with them, and of course pedophiles probably are considered among sexual offenders. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And
yes. Well, a pedophile is a sexual offender always, because a child is incapable of actually consenting to sex.
True.
So a pedophile that has sex with a child always rapes the child, because the child is incapable of consent.
Are they always men?
No, they're not. In fact, there's quite a growing group of female pedophiles. In fact, that very case I mentioned earlier, the one that got me into profiling, was the first conviction of a woman in South Africa where a woman was put onto the sexual offenders list.
How old was his victim back then?
There were a couple of victims. There were three. There was an 11-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 14-year-old.
Was she a teacher?
Sorry?
Was she a teacher?
No, she was a lawyer, an advocate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, that was part of aggravation of sentence, because she was found to have used a position of trust to actually, in the first place, get access to the children. And in the second place, assist him to rape them. And of course, with the change in the definition of rape in South Africa, which was recent, it changed, the definition has been now updated to a statutory and not a common law definition. So rape is now generally and broadly defined as the penetration of any orifice with any part of the body or any instrument.
Oh. So does that mean that maybe a killer who stabs someone then puts his finger into someone's wound, would that be considered also as a sexual assault, as an additional potential charge? Or does it just help identify the killer as possibly having sexual?
Yeah. Well, most, the one thing that defines a serial killer is the fantasy element. So yeah, I mean, and often the sadistic element.
So sex is someone always involved in this, in the worst crimes, probably. Can that be said?
Well, yeah, it can, but it's more fantasy, which is regularly linked to sexual fantasy.
But that's not only that.
And that is why serial killing always escalates, because you'll find that the offender will fantasize, commit the murder, and the murder won't live up to the fantasy. And the next time they'll take it a step further, which is why these crimes usually escalate in aggression and severity over time. Yeah.
Wow. Is moving back to the female sexual offender, and this is more a question out of my curiosity. What happened in that case? Would the fact that there are children that are going through puberty make... What was the defense? That's what I'm interested in. What was the position? She's not a lawyer. Probably she had her own lawyers. What was the defense in her case?
Her defense was that she did what she did to please him, the male perpetrator, the partner, and that she was afraid that if she didn't comply with what he wanted, she would be in danger, which was absolute rubbish. But yeah,
okay,
that was her defense, that she was a battered woman, basically, which I testified. I did the pre-sentence report there for the state, and that defense was destroyed. What I think really was the case there was that she was a dependent personality disorder person, because she definitely did have a need to please him, and he was a sexual sadist, an antisocial, and a narcissist, all rolled into one. So he was a very controlling personality. She was a very dependent personality, and he was clever. He isolated her from her family. He sexually abused her. He destroyed her. He made her renounce her religion. There was a lot of coercion going on, but she was a lawyer, and she knew the law, and she chose to break the law, and she went to prison. Well, she was sentenced to 7 years for her part in the crime.
And she did it 3 times.
He got away scot-free because he jumped bail, and he ended up in Belarus, where he continued the pattern, molested a whole bunch of women there, raped women, had 2 children, and then tried to rob a bank in Belarus. And that led to his arrest, and he's still incarcerated there. He got in 2010. He got a 13-year sentence. So, we don't want him back. But we were hoping that he'd meet some terrible end in Belarus before we get him back, because nobody wants to go back into that trial. But it just shows you that these guys repeat their patterns. They escalate. The drive is there. That is what they do. He was particularly interesting. He insisted that his victims, he would tattoo them, his name on their genitals. And that was sort of, so he would brand them almost like possession.
So that was his signature.
That was sort of his signature. And he would change them. He wanted a certain image, and he would insist that they had breast enlargements and starved themselves and conformed to what he believed was his ideal woman. So he would shape them, personality, body, everything to live up to his so-called standard.
What about
very, very narcissistic, very, very egotistical.
So there's a lot of narcissism normally in these kind of profiles. Is that right? Or not always?
There is regularly. Also, antisocial personality disorder is quite common. Borderline personality disorder is quite common.
Are they all smart?
It just depends on what is the driver of the crime. What is the need?
Are they normally all smart, or does it really? Do you have those kind of sexual offenders coming from very, very different backgrounds?
They come from all backgrounds. Serial offenders with antisocial personality disorder are usually of a higher intelligence than is, say, for example, a disorganized murderer. Once they can organize and plan and so forth, and they get away with multiple crimes, then they're normally highly organized offenders. They follow forensics, they study forensics, they know their forensic countermeasures. So they put quite a bit of research into their crimes. In Africa, it's very different. In Africa, you'll find that most serial murder is very disorganized. There are crimes of opportunity. For example, they will lure a victim on the pretense of giving them a job and then take them off.
To take advantage of
pretending to have an interview and then strangle them with their own underwear or use a knife or something like that. They're very crude crimes usually in Africa.
They lure them into traps, basically. Is there always
with the promise of employment usually?
Okay, because is it something people are? Of course, it makes people vulnerable, I guess.
Well, remember, a lot of people in Africa are starving. They're hungry. They're uneducated. There isn't much opportunity, so they're very easy to lure.
Is there always a trigger? Like, is it normally people living a normal life and then something happens, and then all of a sudden they find themselves being these talking about serial killers, of course, or is it something that it's somehow always been there?
I think with most of the serial killers, they have a background that's very torrid. They usually come from very violent backgrounds. They're not generally kids that have just had a normal life and then something's happened and they've turned into a serial killer. There's normally a lot of anger. They come from broken homes, very torrid upbringings with violent histories. Most of them are antisocials, so they will have been diagnosed or have displayed elements of conduct disorder before the age of 50.
Okay, so that would be either at school or I don't know, being violent with animals, these kind of things.
Yes, a lot of the time you'll see the cruelty to animals quite early on. They're not difficult to track, and they don't just overnight become a serial offender. you'll find that there's delinquency early on, and then you'll find that there's probably a sexual assault or two along the way while they're learning. So they usually have fairly good criminal resumes before they actually, start with the murdering.
It feels like it's almost like a foreseeable pattern. Like, for instance, if it was assigned to a computer to identify with a grade of chance that someone would turn into a serial killer by the age of 30, you probably would be able to, if feeding that data into one brain.
I'm actually busy developing a profiling system for violence and sex crime that will also profile abduction and missing persons.
Oh, wow.
So I'm busy doing the development now. It's quite far down the line already. It's called ViceCat. And it's a system that law enforcement will be able to use to track all sex and violent crime globally. We're hoping.
That's an interesting one, because that's it's a sort of Minority Report kind of technology, so something that I guess people wouldn't be comfortable 100% with. But in terms of it being used only by, of course, the police, it is definitely an important crystal ball that you can give in their hands to actually start anticipating with probability, but still better than nothing, than having no clue. Just looking back at the data and people's behavior in the past.
Absolutely, and the thing is, once you start capturing sex crime, as well as abduction and violent crime, you will start to see the patterns, because the actual tool is very interesting. It doesn't only profile the offender, it profiles the victim. So that you will also be able to identify, and it'll be predictive. It's AI, so it will predict the type of, you'll see what is the typology of the victim, where are they coming from, where are the drop sites, where's the crime scene, what does the crime scene look like, how quickly is it escalating,
and based on that, also, how likely it is going to be a killer that has a certain profile versus another one, of course.
Predictive. So, and remember, with serial murder as well, people get very confused between the different types of murder. So, I mean, there's mass murder, there's serial murder, there's spree killing, and they're different.
Of course.
Serial murder is very specific in that there's an escalation period, then there's a murder, then there's a cooling off period, and then the fantasy kicks in, and the drive kicks in again, and the need kicks in again, and then the escalation period starts again. So there's always with serial murder a cooling off period, which can get shorter, but it's not a spree killing where you have, multiple offenses quite quickly. There's always a pattern in the serial murder. In fact, some serial killers will only kill on a specific day each year.
Yeah.
Because that's the signature element. And also with serial, what makes it very interesting, a serial murder specifically, or rape for that matter, there is always a signature and a modus operandi.
Yeah.
And the signature will remain constant. The modus operandi will always evolve.
Why do they leave signatures? Do they want to be caught? No, they don't. They just want to be recognized.
No, it's the drive. That is the drive that's being fulfilled. So once you can identify the signature aspect, and you can identify what the motivation is and what they're actually trying to accomplish from the murder, that the signature will tell you that. The modus operandi and the way they commit the crime will evolve, because a killer learns from his mistakes.
Yeah.
Just the same as an employee learns from his mistakes. So they learn to tie better knots. They learn better methods for abduction. They learn better ways of holding the victim. They learn better ways of restraining the victim. They learn better ways of torturing the victim. Because a lot of the time, especially with sadistic murderers, in the beginning, they're quite clumsy and they don't actually know how much the human body can endure. So they kill by accident.
Does that mean that also the victimology somehow evolves? So maybe they start with someone that's weak, and then maybe you find out that the victim number 6 is, a bodybuilder.
No, not usually. It depends. That will again, your victimology will link straight back to your fantasy element
so that
as
will
well.
there will
Again,
always be a
what
pattern.
are they trying to accomplish? And it's also very interesting in that specifically with serial murder and rape, you very seldom find that it moves across the race barrier. So if you have a black victim, chances are your perpetrator will be black. If you have a white victim, chances are your perpetrator will be white. Because the fantasy seldom occurs across the racial barrier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very strange thing. Where you do see it deviate is where the fantasy is linked to, say, prostitution.
Okay.
Then then the race won't come in because the target is the prostitute.
Or there's hate, maybe against another race. Or
there's hate for a prostitute. But often these murders are linked to a very, very specific victimology. So the victimology often does not evolve because it's part of the fantasy. It's either revenge against the mother or somebody that's harmed them in some way and they're killing that person over and over again.
You mentioned something really interesting before about reverting back to childhood and how that may be not only an indicator, the behavior of the child and the kind of patterns in terms of social issues, but also maybe, and very, very likely, the relationship of their parents and between their parents. Because it feels like, and this is something I've discovered basically by becoming a father and then started to think about what kind of father I want to be, and then, what kind of father was my father, and, what kind of mistakes did my parents make, and how can I be better, and so on. So this is probably the father, becoming father of yourself is, I think, a term that gets used a lot. But basically what happens is this switch where you're trying to understand and identify those holes and gaps that have been left in your childhood, trying not to replicate those. And it feels like with this kind of profiles that you mentioned, so serial killers, for instance, there's always something that didn't work, as you said, in their childhood, whether it's the neighborhood, whether it's probably the relationship between their parents. Maybe there's a violent mother, and if there's a violent mother, maybe that frustrates the child, and definitely there's something there, right?
Well, yeah, children model the behavior that they see. I mean, that's one of the ways that we learn. If you are constantly exposed to a certain behavior pattern, you model it. And that is where the whole concept of the cycle of violence comes from. And that's why it's so difficult to break.
How's it called? Cycle of
violence. Because we model what we see. It's the same as if a child grows up with a parent that has a very poor judgment. They tend to exhibit poor judgment. If there's no consequences for behavior, they tend to repeat it. If a parent is constantly modeling violence, that becomes the norm.
Do you think with the increase of general wealth and access to information, so that myself can document on how to be a better parent and so on, maybe these kind of issues have decreased throughout the years? Or do you think serial murderers are always been a certain percentage of the population and will always be this?
You know, I have kind of a split view on that. A couple of things. With the advent of technology, people have lost patience. So, you know, I always give the example of when I was growing up, we had no computers, we had no cell phones. If you had to do a school project, you had to plan. You had to go to the library. You had to, you know, put your project together. You had to make sure you had your photocopies. You had to cut out your pictures. You had to allocate time. And you had to plan so that you could get your project in on time. Today, the children don't have to do that. They go on Google 5 minutes before they plagiarize everything and they hand it in. So, you know, for me, what we've become sort of a culture almost of instant gratification, and we don't plan anymore. We're not even half these kids don't even know what a consequence is anymore. You know, I've had parents that have tried to discipline their children where the child has turned around and gone to the police and reported the parents for disciplining them. You know, we've lost discipline. With the hackers, there's what we call it's almost the morality is so skewed that they believe that if you don't have the correct firewalls in place and things, they're entitled to hack you. So we're seeing such a shift in humanity and the way that morality is seen, ethical flexibility in society. You know, if it works for me today, it works. And unfortunately, it's a very narcissistic culture. And when people learn that that's the way they can function in life, everything starts to slip. And when you repeat a behavior and there's no consequence, and you repeat it and there's no consequence,
It's reinforced.
and you repeat it and there's no consequence, it just gets reinforced. And, you know, yeah, it's great that we have information at our fingertips, and we can go and research about being better parents. But you know, one has to wonder then again, if you want to feed the fantasy, there's a million porn sites. You get on your computer and you've got access to 5,000 ideas at your fingertips.
The internet is for porn, as they say.
Exactly. So, you know, it's a catch-22 as far as I'm concerned. Yes, the technology is wonderful and it makes our lives a lot easier, but is it contributing to the culture of criminality? Yes, I think it definitely does.
So it's, by one way of seeing,
it's a double-edged sword.
On one side, it's probably not even double-edged, to be honest. By the way you're expressing it, it feels like it's damaging society in very deep and profound ways, human behavior, and then it's also facilitating work. Of course, it's going to facilitate it also for the police and whoever is investigating, because everything is trackable.
And also the gaming side of, I mean, it's fabulous, all these games and things these kids play, but violent behavior is reinforced from the Disney Channel, where, you know, you can kill Mickey Mouse and Mickey Mouse jumps up and runs away 5 minutes later. How many times was the Roadrunner flattened? You know? Children don't understand the concept and the finality of death. Also, rude, obnoxious, cheeky behavior is modeled to children on TV. So, you know, it skews the boundaries of respect and human decency. Then you have the computer games, which are violent. I mean, they're running around with swords. There's blood. There's guns. There's everything. They're feeding this culture of violence to these children. They're actually creating psychopaths. Sadly, but that's what's happening.
Yeah, awakening the psychopath. psychopath in them for sure.
Well, the thing is, you can learn the brain, the subconscious, doesn't understand the difference between reality and fantasy.
Mhm.
The subconscious part of the brain. So if you are in a game, a child is in a game, tuning its mind to blood and murder and chopping people up with swords and all sorts of things, that is what they are developing
Yeah.
as their norm.
I noticed in myself a certain level of unsensitivity towards blood in general because I've been playing video games since I was younger. So it's definitely the case, I think. You're right.
You know, I mean, the one thing that I can tell you as a person that's worked with death is when you see it on TV, it is the norm. The only real difference in the real world is, for example, when you walk into a mortuary, and you're confronted with the smells and these things. This makes it real, because but you're not confronted with that when you're killing somebody, unfortunately, because they haven't had time to start smelling really bad, because that's normally only what the investigator's faced with.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's become a free-for-all. And the only people that really suffer and that end up needing the psychological help are the police and the investigators that have to deal with the aftermath. And this is contributing to a massive spike in police suicide.
Or even just depression, I guess, right?
Yeah, law enforcement is in trouble. I mean, South Africa a while ago was one of the highest countries in the world with the highest rates of police officers killing their entire families because they don't feel that their families should be subjected to the world and they can't cope. So they not only commit suicide, but they take the whole family with them.
Horrible.
It's an interesting world we live in.
It's a world that requires a lot of shielding and support, especially for a child to grow in. And it's really hard because changes used to be, you used to take a generation. So, for instance, Industrial Revolution, 100 years, then there's TV, 50 years, still, you'd have a big difference between yourself and your grandfather, and maybe your father was more or less aware of the same kind of games he would play when he was younger. But nowadays, even if I had a child and I was 10, when I was 10, there would still be a huge difference between the cartoons or the games, the way of gaming, the kind of social networks and the things I would do in life. So there will be a huge generational gap, and it will be even harder for me to support my child in a world I don't really understand myself. So it's going to become even worse.
And unfortunately, we live in a society where the adults are so busy with their own self-gratification that they're not paying attention to their children. It's far easier to dump your child in front of the TV and go and play with your wife than it is to actually give that child the attention that it needs. I don't know why humanity is breeding like it's breeding, because the parents are no longer interested in their children. They're so busy with their lives, and there's, take a child should be limited. I mean, by all means, don't deprive them of technology. They have to grow up in it. The world is evolving. You cannot take it away from them. But give them their TV time. But at the same time, take that child for a walk, spend time with them, teach them to work with their hands, give them coloring crayons, make them work in the real world. because children today don't understand. Everything's virtual. They don't even know how to function in the real world. They cannot change a light bulb.
Mm-hmm.
So you're having this generation that's growing up that's actually incapable of looking after themselves at a human level, but they're great on the computer. You cannot talk to your clients in business. They don't know how to relate unless it's a text or a WhatsApp or a smiley face or an emoji. But you try and get a young person to talk to a client, to actually interact. And it's becoming very, very much more difficult. And this is it was a very interesting conversation I had with a human resource person. He said they don't know what to do with the modern generation because they don't know how to talk. They've lost the skill of basic communication.
No, not to mention writing.
Well, yeah, spell check. None of them can spell.
I find myself writing in English way better than my English colleagues sometimes, and I'm not the best anyway. So it's that tells you everything.
Yeah, look, I think humanity's just facing a lot of challenges, and as I said, I think you always have to look at the pros and the cons, and they're definitely both.
I am. So we've been talking for an hour now, so I'm wondering if you're happy for us to keep on with another couple of topics, or up to you, really.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've got time. I'm not in a rush.
I've got a huge list anyway of questions, so I think I can break them down anyway in a couple. Trying to see what to prioritize. Hormones. They do affect our they do affect our brain.
Absolutely. Hormones and steroids and anything that you put into your body affects your brain.
Even what we eat.
Even what you eat. Exactly. Every single thing that you put into your body or into your psychology affects you in some way or another.
Is it?
And definitely hormones, steroids, drugs, any chemical that you put into your body is dangerous. Depending on how your body metabolizes it, more or less dangerous to the person that's using the substance.
And on the flip side, also the opposite happens. So maybe your mood affects how your body reacts.
Oh, definitely. Because remember, your body is producing its own endorphins all the time as well.
Is this ever been used in trials as a justification, such maybe, I don't know, having a period for a woman and killing someone on that exact date?
Definitely. I mean, there's been a lot of trials linked to not necessarily having a period, but yes, there have been those too. But definitely with postpartum depression, hormonal imbalances, that sort of thing, steroid rage. There's been a lot of trials where that's been put forward as defense. Yeah.
What happened with Pistorius?
Pistorius, my nemesis. I worked the Pistorius case. Strangely enough, I was the forensic consultant for CNN. But then I also did a lot of the work I worked with RPL in Germany and Channel 7 in Australia and a few other media.
How long did the trial last?
You know what? In the end, I think it was, what was it? About 9 months in total.
So pregnancy, basically.
But then, of course, it didn't end at the trial because then it went to appeal.
Right.
Afterwards. My opinion was never really changed. It was actually a very good friend of mine was actually the DNA expert, the blood spatter expert on that case as well. And we pretty much had it pegged from the beginning. I mean, I said very, very early on, I think I was the first person that went on record saying that I did not believe the offender story. I believe that they had an argument, that it started fairly early in the evening. I believed, and I'm still of the opinion, and it's just my opinion, anybody can feel free to disagree, that he is very narcissistic. He likes to get his own way. I predicted that he would end up in trouble for a violent crime, probably 12 months before he did, when he had his outburst at the Olympics. And, you know, for me, a person that cannot contain their aggression in front of the media when he was beaten, and the way that he reacted so violently at that Olympics was indication that there was a lot of rage already. And I said at the time, this little man will find himself in trouble with the law for a violent crime within the next 2 years. And it was 1 year exactly. So I was shouted down. I was vilified because I had now attacked South Africa's icon. But I wasn't terribly bothered. I didn't like what I was seeing. There was a pattern of irresponsible behavior. There was the boating accident where he was drinking. There was the restaurant accident where, again, when you get away with things and there's no consequences, your behavior escalates. He got his friend to take responsibility for the shooting in the restaurant. Somebody else took responsibility every time he made a mistake or did something irresponsible. You know, they were driving around with guns, shooting at road signs and traffic lights. You know, this isn't really behavior that's not that's indicating a stable person. No. But every time somebody else took responsibility, so there were never any consequences for Mr. Pistorius. So he learned that he could get away with just about anything. He became part of South Africa's brand. So they did everything they could to protect him. And, you know, this little girl, I think, denied him what he wanted. I have other information. Apparently, she was told by her agent to distance herself from him. And I think she was trying to do that. He wanted her to go on an athletics tour with him for 6 months. I think she said no. And I think that was when the argument started. I think it was over that. That's my personal opinion from what I heard. And I think it escalated and escalated and escalated. And she made I think it got to the point where she said, "I'm leaving now," got up to dress, and that set him off. And I think she ran to the bathroom to try and shield herself. And he basically lost the plot, hunted her down, and put 4 bullets in her. I don't think it's anything more or less serious than that. He just lost his cool, lost his temper, was naturally inclined and enjoyed the gun scenario. Yeah. And what amazed me more than anything in the Pistorius case was how quickly he went from killing her to covering it up, which indicated to me that he's not much short of a psychopath, because he didn't seek help. No. Security guards arrived. He told them there was nothing wrong. He phoned his criminal friend that owns investment cars. That was his first port of call, to ask him what to do. Not the police, not the paramedics.
Someone he trusted.
Someone he trusted to tell him how to cover it up. And then always what worried me is he said that he spoke to paramedics at the bail hearing, and that the paramedics told him to put her in the car and bring her to the hospital. Now, you tell me logically, what paramedic would tell a person with no legs and probably very poor balance to pick up his girlfriend that he just put 4 hollow point bullets into and bring her to the hospital in a car? I mean, it was so ludicrous, it didn't make sense. And you know what, for me, when a story doesn't make sense, it's not true.
Also, normally when it's that bad, they would send the ambulance there because it will be quicker to get there and stabilize the person rather to wait the car to get to the hospital anyway.
But what operator would even give that kind of advice? I mean, if you know somebody's got a bullet wound in them, it's shrapnel.
Yeah.
Shrapnel can sever more arteries, cut more muscle. In any case, according to the forensic pathologist and to my friend, all 3 shots that hit her were independently fatal. So the one almost severed her arm and had exposed the artery, so she would have bled out through the arm. The one went through her head and into the base of her neck. That was the kill shot. They said was the kill shot, but the other one went into the uterine artery in the hip, and she would have bled out through that too. So all 3 gunshots were independently fatal.
It's been there was a disturbing story, like any of these stories are disturbing.
But it was predictable, you know, and unfortunately, very sad. But you know, the lead up was there. All the indicators that he was violent, not necessarily that he would kill her, because you know one normally goes through a little bit more of a cycle of possibly an assault. But there was an assault because it came out that he had assaulted his previous girlfriend.
Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, there's a pattern there, and someone should have seen it. His entourage, family.
Well, I think people did see it. They
covered
just
it.
didn't. Yeah, no, because they couldn't afford to damage the brand.
Gotcha. One other question I have, which is actually, I think it's the last one. Yeah, I think it's a good one to close with. That's more of a personal kind of question. So I hope it's not too complex to interpret. When you go through interrogation techniques and profiling, of course, you start reading and seeing people in a different way. How has that helped you in life? And is there any specific traits that you always try to avoid in people that you think are more dangerous than other, or not to the violent level, but even psychologically?
I think, look, I definitely have heightened situational awareness. So I read situations very, very quickly. I also, with the knowledge of interviewing and interrogation and body language, it's very easy for me to spot somebody who's dishonest. I tend to look for interactions with people that I find real and that I feel can contribute to my life. I avoid people that show any tendencies towards violence. I stay away from them. I believe also that patterns are always repeated. The first time anybody were to lift a hand to me would be the last time they would see me. Any woman that sticks around a violent man can expect more violence, in my opinion. So I think that's what's helped me. I read situations very quickly. I know when to leave a party. I'll often see that, oh dear, here we go. We've had far too much to drink. This one's getting out of hand, and I will leave the party before anything happens. I do spend a lot of time with animals. I also do a lot of animal behaviors. I find that I get a lot of relief out of that. I rescue wildlife, and I ride horses. So I spend a lot of time with my animals, looking at how animals interact with each other and how that body language spills to humans sometimes. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
If you compare. But yeah, I think it's just a case of having very astute judgment. And that's how it's helped me. It's hindered me in that I tend to take a lot longer than most people to trust. I really do believe that trust is earned, not given, and that you need to at least protect yourself as far as you can, because you don't know in today's world what to expect from people. It's not simple like it used to be.
Better safe than sorry, anyway.
And far better to approach with caution and let a relationship develop. I also believe that in taking things slowly, get to know the people that are in your life, talk to them, listen to them, because people tell you so much about themselves just in their reactions. If you just open your mind and look at people, take your eyes off yourself and put them onto who you're interacting with, and then make your decisions and your judgments. And the other thing that I've learned is trust your gut. Your intuition 90% of the time is correct.
Our brain is wired to avoid danger.
Especially a woman's. A man not as well wired, strangely enough. But remember that a woman is traditionally the weaker species in the body, naturally. I mean, we're not as strong as men. So we are wired with additional intuition to keep us safe, because a woman's chances of survival are flight, not fight, usually. The man's bigger, stronger. So if your gut is telling you something, listen to it. It'll save your life. It really will.